The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road that cut through the South Dakota plains. Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled on the steering wheel as her vision blurred once again. She had been driving for 3 days straight, fleeing from a life that had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The divorce papers sat crumpled in the passenger seat beside an empty coffee cup and the last $20 to her name. She had left everything behind in Chicago, her cheating husband, her so-called friends who had known about the affair, and the fancy apartment that had never really felt like home. Her head pounded with a migraine that had been building for hours. The air conditioning in her old sedan had given out somewhere in Nebraska, and the heat was suffocating. Sarah barely registered the sign welcoming her to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting as many miles as possible between herself and her old life. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and her phone battery was dying. She was utterly, completely lost. The world started spinning. Sarah pressed harder on the gas pedal, desperate to find somewhere, anywhere to stop. But her body had other plans. 3 days of no sleep, minimal food, and crushing emotional trauma finally caught up with her. Her foot slipped off the pedal. The car lurched and swerved. She managed to pull onto the shoulder just as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. Sarah stumbled out of the car, her legs buckling beneath her. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she collapsed onto the dirt road. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was a pair of worn leather boots approaching and the silhouette of a man against the blazing sun. When she came to, strong hands were lifting her gently. Sarah's eyes fluttered open to see a weathered face looking down at her with concern. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with long silver-streaked black hair tied back and deep-set eyes that held both wisdom and kindness. He wore simple jeans and a faded blue shirt, but there was something about his presence that commanded respect. "Easy now," he said, his voice calm and steady. "You're going to be all right." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. The man, she would later learn his name was Thomas White Eagle, a Lakota chief and elder of the community, carried her as easily as if she weighed nothing. He placed her in the shade of a nearby cottonwood tree and brought water from his truck. She drank gratefully, her senses slowly returning. "What happened?" Sarah managed to croak out. "You collapsed," Thomas said simply. "Lucky I was driving by. This road doesn't see much traffic." He studied her carefully, taking in her disheveled appearance, the dark circles under her eyes, and the pain written across her features. "You running from something or running to something?" The question, asked with such gentle directness, broke something loose inside Sarah. Tears streamed down her face before she could stop them. "I don't know anymore," she whispered. "I just needed to get away." Thomas nodded, as if he understood completely. He didn't press for details or offer empty platitudes. Instead, he sat beside her in the shade, a quiet presence that somehow made her feel less alone than she had in months. After a few minutes of silence, he spoke again. "There's a community center not far from here. My daughter runs it. They've got food, beds for travelers passing through. You look like you could use both." He paused, then added, "No judgment, no questions you don't want to answer. Just a safe place to rest." Sarah looked at this stranger who had literally lifted her up from the dust and seen her at her absolute lowest point. She had no reason to trust him, no reason to trust anyone. But something in his eyes told her that he was offering exactly what he said, nothing more, nothing less. A safe place to rest. After 3 days of running, that sounded like a gift from heaven. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." Thomas helped her to her feet, steady and patient as she found her balance. Little did Sarah know that this moment of collapse would become the foundation for the most transformative chapter of her life. The community center was nothing like Sarah had imagined. She had pictured something institutional and cold, but instead found herself in a warm, welcoming space filled with the aroma of sage and cooking food. Thomas's daughter, Maria, was a woman in her 40s with her father's kind eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She took one look at Sarah and immediately ushered her to a small bedroom in the back of the center. "You sleep first," Maria said firmly. "Everything else can wait." Sarah wanted to protest, to explain herself, to apologize for being a burden. But exhaustion won. She fell into the narrow bed and slept for 16 hours straight, her body finally surrendering to the rest it so desperately needed. When she woke, the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. For the first time in months, she felt almost human again. Maria brought her breakfast, scrambled eggs, fried bread, and strong coffee. Sarah ate ravenously, suddenly aware of how hungry she actually was. As she ate, Maria explained that the center served as a gathering place for the community, offering meals, educational programs, and support for anyone who needed it. Sarah learned that Thomas was not just any elder but a respected chief who had dedicated his life to preserving Lakota traditions and helping his people navigate the challenges of modern life. "My father has a gift," Maria said softly. "He sees people, really sees them. Not what they show the world, but who they are underneath." She refilled Sarah's coffee cup. "He saw something in you yesterday. That's why he brought you here." Sarah didn't know what to say to that. She felt like a shell of a person, hollowed out by betrayal and failure. What could anyone possibly see in her now? But she kept these thoughts to herself and simply thanked Maria for the kindness. Over the next few days, Sarah remained at the center, helping with small tasks as a way to repay their hospitality. She washed dishes, swept floors, and assisted with meal preparation. The work was simple and mindless, which suited her perfectly. She wasn't ready to think about the future or make any big decisions. She just wanted to exist quietly in this unexpected sanctuary she had found. Thomas visited the center every day. He never asked Sarah about her past or pressed her to talk about what had brought her to that dusty road. Instead, he told her stories, tales of Lakota history, legends passed down through generations, and personal anecdotes from his own life. Sarah found herself drawn to these stories, hanging on every word. They spoke of resilience, of finding strength in community, of honoring both joy and sorrow as part of the human experience. One evening, Thomas invited Sarah to join him for a walk. They strolled through the reservation as the sun set, and he pointed out landmarks and shared their significance. He showed her where his grandfather had lived, where he had learned to ride horses as a boy, where his wife had loved to watch the stars. Each place held a memory, a piece of his personal history woven into the landscape. "You know what I've learned in all my years?" Thomas asked as they paused at a hilltop overlooking the plains. "We spend so much time running from pain that we forget pain is just part of the journey. It's not the destination. You can't outrun it, but you can learn to carry it differently." His words struck Sarah like a physical blow. She had been running, desperately trying to escape the hurt and humiliation of her failed marriage. But the pain had followed her every mile, sitting in the passenger seat like an unwelcome companion. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe she needed to stop running and face what had happened. "I don't know how to do that," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to carry this pain without it crushing me." Thomas turned to face her, his expression gentle but serious. "You don't do it alone. That's the mistake people make. They think strength means handling everything by themselves. Real strength is knowing when to let others help carry the load." That night, Sarah made a decision. She would stay at Pine Ridge a little longer, not just hiding from her past but actively trying to heal from it. She didn't know what that would look like or how long it would take. But for the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt a tiny flicker of hope. The following weeks brought a rhythm to Sarah's life that she hadn't experienced in years. She woke with the sun, helped prepare breakfast at the center, and spent her days learning from the community around her. Maria taught her about traditional Lakota cooking, showing her how to make wojapi, a traditional berry pudding, and how to fry bread until it was golden and perfect. The simple act of creating something with her hands felt therapeutic in ways Sarah couldn't fully explain. Thomas continued to be a steady presence in her life. He invited her to attend community gatherings where elders shared wisdom and young people asked questions about their heritage. Sarah sat quietly in these circles, absorbing the conversations around her. She was struck by how different this community was from the world she had left behind in Chicago. Here, people valued listening over talking, patience over speed, and collective well-being over individual achievement. One morning, Thomas asked Sarah if she wanted to learn about Lakota spirituality. She hesitated, worried about being disrespectful or appropriating a culture that wasn't hers. Thomas seemed to understand her concern without her voicing it. "I'm not asking you to become Lakota," he explained. "I'm offering to share some of our ways of understanding the world. What you take from it is up to you. But sometimes, learning how others make sense of life can help us make sense of our own." Sarah agreed, and Thomas began teaching her about the concept of mitikuya o yasin, a Lakota phrase meaning all my relations. He explained that it represented the interconnectedness of all living things, the idea that every person, animal, plant, and element of nature was part of one great family. When you hurt one part of that family, you hurt yourself. When you healed one part, you contributed to healing the whole. This philosophy resonated deeply with Sarah. In her old life, everything had been about competition and comparison. She had measured her worth against her colleagues, her marriage against those of her friends, her success against arbitrary benchmarks that never brought satisfaction. The concept of interconnectedness offered a radically different way of seeing herself and her place in the world. Thomas also introduced her to the medicine wheel, explaining its 4 quadrants representing different aspects of life: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. He taught her that true wellness required balance among all 4 areas, and that her collapse on the road had been a sign that she was severely out of balance. "You were running on empty in every way," Thomas said. "Your body was exhausted, your mind was overwhelmed, your emotions were raw, and your spirit was starving. You can't sustain life like that." Sarah realized he was absolutely right. For years, she had neglected her own well-being while trying to maintain the appearance of a perfect life. She had worked 60-hour weeks to avoid confronting problems in her marriage. She had drunk too much wine and scrolled mindlessly through social media instead of dealing with her feelings. She had stopped doing the things that once brought her joy: painting, hiking, spending time in nature. She had lost herself completely. Under Thomas's guidance, Sarah began addressing each area of the medicine wheel. She started taking long walks every morning, rebuilding her physical strength. She journaled in the evenings, processing the thoughts and emotions she had been suppressing for so long. Maria taught her meditation techniques that helped quiet her anxious mind. And spending time in nature, watching the vast South Dakota sky and feeling the wind on her face, slowly began to nourish her starving spirit. But the real breakthrough came during a sweat lodge ceremony that Thomas invited her to attend. Sarah was nervous, unsure what to expect. Thomas explained that the sweat lodge was a purification ritual, a place for prayer, reflection, and healing. He assured her that she could leave at any time if it became too intense. The ceremony was indeed intense. In the darkness of the lodge, with hot stones heating the space and steam rising from water poured over them, Sarah felt every defense she had built up begin to crumble. The prayers spoken in Lakota and English washed over her. The heat forced her to confront her discomfort rather than flee from it. And somewhere in that sacred darkness, surrounded by people who had welcomed her without judgment, Sarah finally allowed herself to grieve. She cried for her failed marriage, for the trust that had been broken, for the future she had imagined that would never come to be. She cried for all the years she had spent trying to be someone she thought she should be instead of discovering who she actually was. The tears came in waves, each one releasing a little more of the pain she had been carrying. When they finally emerged from the lodge, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. Thomas caught her eye and nodded, a small smile on his weathered face. He understood. He had seen this transformation in others before. The collapse had been necessary. Sometimes you had to fall completely apart before you could rebuild yourself into something stronger and more authentic. Sarah had been at Pine Ridge for almost 2 months when her old life came calling. Her phone, which she had been charging but mostly ignoring, rang one afternoon with a call from her sister Jennifer. Sarah stared at the screen, her heart racing. She hadn't spoken to anyone from her past since arriving at the reservation. She had sent one brief text to her sister letting her know she was safe but needed time alone. Now, holding the ringing phone, Sarah felt the pull of 2 different worlds. She answered. Jennifer's voice flooded through, a mixture of relief and frustration. Where had Sarah been? Why hadn't she called? Did she know that David, her ex-husband, had been calling Jennifer trying to find her? The divorce papers needed to be finalized, and Sarah's lawyer needed to speak with her. There were decisions to be made about the apartment, their shared assets, their mutual friends who were taking sides. The real world was demanding her attention, whether she was ready or not. After the call ended, Sarah felt the familiar anxiety creeping back. She found Thomas sitting outside the community center, watching the sunset. She sat beside him and told him about the conversation with her sister, about all the unfinished business waiting for her back in Chicago. "I guess I can't hide here forever," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice light but failing to hide the tremor in it. "You're not hiding," Thomas corrected gently. "You've been healing. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, then continued. "But you're right that eventually you'll need to face what you left behind. The question is whether you'll face it as the same person who ran away, or as the person you're becoming." His words crystallized something Sarah had been feeling but couldn't articulate. She wasn't the same person who had collapsed on that dusty road. The past 2 months had changed her fundamentally. She had learned to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. She had discovered strength in community rather than isolation. She had started to understand that her worth wasn't tied to her marriage, her career, or anyone else's opinion of her. But could she hold on to these lessons when she returned to the environment that had nearly destroyed her? Thomas seemed to read her thoughts. The real challenge isn't learning new ways of being when you're in a supportive environment. The real challenge is maintaining those ways when you return to the chaos. That's where the true test comes. Over the next week, Sarah grappled with what to do. Maria encouraged her to make a plan before leaving, to think carefully about what kind of life she wanted to build. Some of the other women at the center shared their own stories of leaving abusive relationships, battling addiction, or overcoming trauma. Each story reinforced the same truth: healing wasn't linear, and maintaining your progress required ongoing effort and support. Sarah decided she would return to Chicago, but on her own terms. She would finalize the divorce, settle her affairs, but she wouldn't stay in that city or try to rebuild her old life. She started researching jobs in areas closer to nature, places where she could maintain the connection to the land and slower pace of life that had helped her heal. She thought about South Dakota, Montana, maybe Oregon. Somewhere she could start fresh, carrying the lessons she had learned at Pine Ridge into a new chapter. But before she could leave, Thomas asked her to help with a project. The community was organizing a youth camp to teach traditional Lakota skills and values to the next generation. They needed volunteers, and Thomas thought Sarah's perspective as an outsider who had learned to appreciate their ways might be valuable to young people who sometimes took their heritage for granted. Sarah threw herself into the project. She helped organize activities, prepare meals, and set up tents. When the young people arrived, ranging in age from 8 to 17, she was struck by their energy and curiosity. They asked her endless questions about Chicago, about her life before Pine Ridge, about why she had stayed. Sarah found herself telling her story, not the polished, edited version she might have shared in her old life, but the raw, honest truth. She told them about hitting rock bottom, about being lifted up by their grandfather, about learning to heal through community and connection to something larger than herself. One teenager, a girl named Lily who had been sullen and withdrawn, approached Sarah after the talk. "Did you really want to give up?" Lily asked quietly. "Like, completely give up on everything?" Sarah recognized the pain in Lily's eyes. She sat down with the girl and they talked for over an hour. Lily shared her own struggles with depression, with feeling caught between traditional Lakota ways and modern American culture, with not feeling like she belonged anywhere. Sarah listened, really listened, the way Thomas had listened to her. She didn't try to fix Lily's problems or offer easy solutions. She simply witnessed the girl's pain and shared her own experience of finding a path forward one small step at a time. This conversation reminded Sarah why healing mattered, why the work of putting yourself back together was worth the effort. It wasn't just for your own benefit. When you healed yourself, you became capable of helping others heal too. Your pain, once transformed, could become medicine for someone else's wounds. The morning Sarah prepared to leave Pine Ridge, the community gathered to say goodbye. It wasn't a formal ceremony, just people showing up at the center to wish her well and offer parting words. Maria gave her a bundle of sage and a handmade bracelet. Several women shared recipes and phone numbers, making her promise to stay in touch. The young people from the camp made her a card signed by everyone, filled with messages of gratitude and encouragement. Thomas was the last to approach her. He handed her a small leather pouch. Inside was a smooth stone from the nearby river. "When things get hard," he said, "hold this and remember that you don't have to carry everything alone. You're part of something bigger now. You have relations here who care about you, who will always welcome you back." Sarah hugged him tightly, this man who had quite literally lifted her up when she had fallen and then patiently taught her how to stand on her own feet. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life." Thomas shook his head. "I just helped you remember how to save yourself. That strength was in you all along. You just needed time and space to find it again." The drive back to Chicago felt different from the desperate flight that had brought her to South Dakota. Sarah drove with purpose now, stopping to rest when she was tired, eating regular meals, taking time to appreciate the landscape around her. She wasn't running anymore. She was moving forward with intention. In Chicago, Sarah faced the task she had been avoiding. She met with her lawyer and signed the final divorce papers without tears or drama. She sorted through the apartment, taking only what truly mattered to her and leaving the rest. She had coffee with Jennifer and honestly discussed what had happened in her marriage and why she had needed to disappear for a while. Her sister didn't fully understand, but she tried, and that was enough. Most significantly, Sarah had difficult conversations with friends who had known about David's affair but said nothing. She explained that their silence had hurt her almost as much as the betrayal itself. Some friendships survived these conversations. Others didn't. Sarah made peace with both outcomes. She was learning to value quality over quantity, authenticity over convenience. She gave notice at her high-stress corporate job and started applying for positions in Montana and South Dakota that aligned more closely with her values. She took a job with a nonprofit organization focused on youth mentorship programs, accepting a significant pay cut but gaining work that felt meaningful. She rented a small house outside Missoula, Montana, with a view of the mountains and space for a garden. But Sarah didn't sever ties with Pine Ridge. She returned every few months, volunteering at the community center and maintaining the relationships she had built. She attended Lily's high school graduation and cried with pride as the young woman spoke about finding her place in the world. She learned more from Thomas and the elders, deepening her understanding of interconnectedness and balance. Pine Ridge became her spiritual home even as she built a new physical home in Montana. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that moment of collapse on a dusty South Dakota road as the worst and best thing that had ever happened to her. It had stripped away everything she thought defined her: her marriage, her career, her carefully constructed image of success. But in losing all of that, she had found something infinitely more valuable: herself. Her authentic self, not the person she thought she should be or the role she thought she needed to play. She often thought about the moment Thomas had lifted her from the dirt, how that simple act of compassion from a stranger had set everything in motion. It reminded her that we never know how our actions might impact another person's life. A moment of kindness offered without expectation of return could change someone's entire trajectory. Thomas had given her a gift that day, and Sarah tried to pay it forward however she could. She volunteered as a mentor for women going through divorces. She shared her story at support groups, always emphasizing that healing was possible but rarely linear. She taught art classes at a local community center, encouraging people to express emotions they couldn't put into words. She maintained a small practice of checking in on people who seemed to be struggling, offering presence without judgment, just as Thomas had done for her. Sarah never remarried, but she built a rich, full life surrounded by genuine relationships and meaningful work. She hiked in the mountains every weekend. She painted again, creating pieces that reflected her journey from collapse to resurrection. She learned to play the flute and joined a community music group. She adopted a rescue dog who became her constant companion. She grew vegetables in her garden and shared them with neighbors. She celebrated small joys and allowed herself to feel sadness without letting it consume her. On the anniversary of the day she had collapsed, Sarah always drove to a hilltop near her home and watched the sunset, holding the smooth river stone Thomas had given her. She thought about the journey she had taken from that desperate, broken woman on the road to the grounded, purposeful person she had become. The pain of her past hadn't disappeared, it was still part of her story. But it no longer defined her. She had learned to carry it differently, as Thomas had said, integrating it into a larger narrative of resilience and growth. And every time she held that stone, Sarah whispered the same words: Mitakuyo Yasin. All my relations. She thought of Thomas and Maria, of Lily and all the young people she had met at camp, of the women at the center who had shared their stories, of everyone who had helped her along the way. She thought of the interconnected web of humanity that had caught her when she fell and taught her how to soar again. She had collapsed at the feet of a Lakota chief who had lifted her up, but the real miracle was that he had taught her how to lift herself up, and in doing so, how to help lift others.